like to thank Aaron and the whole Taxsutra team for having this little birthday party for BEPS as we talk about the 5 years of BEPS. I don't know if someone's going to put up my presentation. It has been an interesting 5 years, and I think it's important to look back and see where this started and to see where we have come, because I think we have come a very long way in the whole implementation of the BEPS project. If we look, we will see that, I'm not sure where I point. Okay. Thank you. If we go back and we look at the whole BEPS project, why did we initiate this? Well, we initiated it because of the financial crisis. The financial and economic crisis really put political weight behind an issue that tax administrations had for a long time been very concerned about, and that is the whole issue of aggressive tax planning, tax avoidance, and the fact that their tax bases were being eroded. And so with the economic crisis of 2008, there was a lot less tolerance for this kind of activity. And if you look at what the OECD did at that time, the first focus was on tax evasion, illegal activity. And there, as I think you all know, we've done a lot of work through our Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information to eliminate bank secrecy, to eliminate bearer shares, to do a lot of things to eliminate the tools that tax evaders were using to evade taxes. At the same time, countries were equally concerned about tax avoidance, and that's where the BEPS project came from. And part of the political impetus behind this project really had to do with the fact that the media and NGOs were highlighting the tax planning strategies of major multinationals in the press and elsewhere, showing how major multinationals were able to legally pay little or no tax anywhere in the world. And so that was a lot of the basis for the BEPS project. And you'll see here on my slide, I have the logos for each of the G20 countries that supported the initiative, because without that big push from the G20 to take action and to take action quickly, this project I don't think would have succeeded. Because countries individually had taken different measures, but without that big political push, it was very hard for countries to move forward. And so it was really in 2012, under the G20 Mexican presidency, where the OECD was tasked by these major economies to look into the issue of base erosion and profit shifting. And you will all recall the report that we published in July, in July of 2013, with an action plan for dealing with BEPS. And following on from the action plan, which was really highlighting areas where we need to focus, at the end of 2015, we produced the 15 reports that are the package of measures that have been agreed. And I'm sure everyone here knows those measures, but I thought I'd just put it back up here for you to recall the various different areas that we were trying to address, and the different sort of themes to what we were trying to do. So in looking at policy coherence, for example, we were trying to ensure that the laws of different countries that were being exploited through a lot of tax planning strategies had a coherent approach, and so they weren't inadvertently undermining each other. So that's where you get actions like hybrid mismatch arrangements or the limitation on interest deductions, those kinds of things, which frankly in the past we had never done before. We'd never really looked at what were traditionally domestic tax policy issues, and so this was a very big change in our project, focusing on substance. That dealt mainly with our tax treaty and transfer pricing work, and there we have made a lot of changes. And then, of course, transparency, just having more information, more data about what taxpayers were doing so that tax administrations and tax policymakers could respond in a more real-time way. And then we had the two overarching initiatives, one on the digital economy, Action 1, and then the multilateral instrument, which I think you all know is now a reality, when at the time what we were just hoping for is to come up with a feasible plan. And so what have we been doing? Well, we have been, since 2015, and I think that is really a key point of departure. So while we're talking about BEPS at 5 years, keep in mind that the final agreed package of the G20 and OECD countries really was only finalized in October 2015, and here we are in October of 2018, 3 years later. And so implementation, while it has been very swift, at the same time, it still requires more work. There's still more to be done. And so the big focus of our work has been on helping countries to implement. The other big thing, and it's the first thing here that is mentioned, is that one of the first things that we did was to ensure that we had as many interested countries as possible around the table. And today we have 119 countries that are members of the Inclusive Framework on BEPS, which I think is pretty extraordinary. But it's understandable because all countries that have tax systems are affected by base erosion and profit shifting tactics of multinational companies, as well as the preferential regimes that are established by some countries. So that is why, you know, as of this week, we have a new member. You may say, well, the BEPS project is well underway. Why would countries sign up now? Well, I think the reason is that they see a benefit in working together with countries, not only on the implementation of the measures that have been set out, but also because we're working on some additional policy issues, most important of which is the whole issue of the tax challenges of the digital economy, and they want to be at the table when those decisions are being made. So that has been quite an important area of our work. On the digital economy, we, as you may know, this was Action 1, and this was probably one of the most visible examples, if you will, of base erosion and profit shifting and the concerns that countries had. That was why it was Action 1 of the BEPS package. If you go back and look at the Action 1 report, you see a lot of description of what the issues are. You see the important decision being taken by the G20 and OECD countries, highlighting the fact that there is no such thing as the digital economy. You cannot say that this company is digital and this one is not, because increasingly all of the economy is becoming digitalized, and the question is really how digitalized are they, but not whether they are digitalized or not. And so as a result of that recognition, the report said, well, why don't we see first how the other BEPS actions, which will deal with treaty abuse and transfer pricing issues and a whole host of other issues that facilitated base erosion and profit shifting, why don't we see how those measures deal with the issues that we have concerns about with highly digitalized companies before we try to take any specific and more targeted measures. So that was kind of where we left it off. Separately in that report, we said we do recognize that there are wider issues beyond the base erosion and profit shifting issues that these companies raise and that cause problems in terms of the existing international tax architecture. But we did not reach agreement in that report, as you all may recall. What we did say is we recognize that there is a problem and that there may be some solutions. And the report identified 3 specific solutions, but did not make any recommendations on any of those. Why? Because we did not have consensus among countries as to which way to go. And so the report recognized there are these 3 approaches out there: a significant economic presence, withholding taxes, and equalization levies. And it outlined some of the pros and cons of each of these different ways of approaching the issue. But at the end of the day, it said we're not endorsing any of those. We are saying that we know countries may be interested in taking some of these measures, and what we did counsel was that they take these measures keeping in mind their international obligations, whether they're through tax conventions or through other international agreements or other international obligations. For example, within the EU countries have certain limitations as to what they can do. And so that report left that a bit in limbo. We said we would come back to it in 2020. And in the meantime, the G20 continued to feel that pressure to do something in this area. And so they did ask the OECD to produce at least an interim report before 2020. Politicians cannot wait that long, even if technical tax experts can wait that long to come up with a better solution. And so we did just publish in March, and we'll have a whole session tomorrow on dealing with the digital economy, so I don't want to say too much now, but we did produce that report setting out some of the issues that still remain and the current positions of different countries or groups of countries. We will definitively decide this issue by 2020. I think if we don't, even if we currently still have divergences among countries, we have to decide it, because if we don't, then the G20's efforts in this area will have been a failure, and really the OECD's work in this area will have been a failure. So a lot of pressure on us to move ahead in that area. Now, having left that with what is coming ahead, I want to talk, since we're talking about BEPS at 5 years, I want to talk a bit about the achievements so far, because I think there's been a lot that has been achieved. Now, you'll recall that in the slide where I showed you all of the measures, one of the things that I also showed you was the establishment of the inclusive framework. And I think that is probably the single most important achievement, is establishing this framework within which all countries can come together, work together, implement these measures together, and develop the additional measures that still need to be developed together. And as I said, I really think that having brought together 119 countries so far is quite an achievement in a fairly short period of time. Then if we look at the measures, we have the minimum standards. You remember there are 4 of them, even though there are 15 actions. And so I'm going to start with the achievements so far with respect to those minimum standards. And if we start with Action 5, there are actually 2 minimum standards within that minimum standard. First, the whole issue of eliminating harmful preferential regimes, and then second is the spontaneous exchange of rulings. And if you look at this, we have, in a very short period of time, examined 175 regimes. That is a lot of work. Why did we do it so quickly? Well, part of the reason, apart from just the momentum behind the BEPS package, is that as we were doing this, the EU separately came out, the EU Code of Conduct, with this list of non-cooperative jurisdictions, and they were looking beyond just exchange of information and transparency, but also looking at issues of preferential regimes. And so what countries said is they didn't want the EU to be looking at these regimes and assessing them. They would rather have our Forum on Harmful Tax Practices review these regimes, because there the jurisdictions have an equal seat at the table and participate in that whole review. And so we ended up having to accelerate the process by which we did these reviews, so that the EU in its listing process could take into account the reviews carried out by the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices. And here you could see that we have had a lot of progress in this area. Apart from the reviews being carried out in the Forum, we have already seen substantial changes. 31 regimes have already been changed. 81 still require some sort of legislative change, and these are in various stages of process. Let's not forget that legislative changes take time, especially when you're trying to remove a benefit to taxpayers. Never easy. We also reviewed some regimes that turned out not to fall within the criteria of the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices. Just to remind you, the scope of the regimes that we review is limited to highly mobile activities and services, whereas in the EU, they were also looking at more traditional types of regimes, so beyond just highly mobile. Excuse me. We did find 4 regimes had harmful or potentially harmful regimes, but the countries that are operating those regimes have said they will take steps to remove the harmful features. So that is a lot of work just in itself for countries, but also for the Inclusive Frameworks Forum on Harmful Tax Practices. Then in the area of exchange of rulings, we have had countries identify over 17,000 rulings. That number is not the number of exchanges that have taken place because, of course, a lot of these rulings involve transactions that affect more than one country. So there is a much greater multiple of exchanges than just the 17,000 rulings. So we've already seen, I think, a tremendous success in terms of that type of exchange. And the reason, part of the reason this aspect of the minimum standard became so important is that we had things like the Lux leaks, which showed that a lot of tax regimes were being undermined, if you will, by secret rulings being granted by authorities that ended up reducing the tax liabilities of major multinationals down to little or no tax. So that, I think, in and of itself is quite impressive. And with this information, tax authorities will be able to determine much more quickly whether there is noncompliance with their own laws. But I think more fundamentally, the fact that these rulings are being exchanged acts as a deterrent to aggressive tax planning and also to tax authorities that were handing out these types of rulings. So then if you look at Action 6 has to do with preventing treaty abuse and including either LOBs or a principal purpose test and some other things in tax treaties to prevent the abuse of tax treaties. Now here, you'll see that in the slide, I'm also focusing on Action 15, the MLI, because that is the principal vehicle for implementing Action 6 and other elements of the BEPS program, which have to do with treaties. And here again, this idea of an MLI, and I wish Philip Baker were here. I know he's appearing tomorrow by video, but he was an early advocate of having some sort of instrument of this nature. And when we first established Action 15, the idea was to explore whether this was feasible. Our Action 15 report said, yes, it is technically feasible. But then the question was, would countries want to adopt this type of innovative new instrument to amend their bilateral network of treaties? And having had 84 jurisdictions sign up, I think suggests that yes, they were. And why? Because they found, even though it is a very technically complex instrument, it still was going to be a much more efficient way of modifying their treaty network than to go out and negotiate bilaterally. And for for I guess the few in the room who've actually carried out bilateral treaty negotiations, these can take years because even if you just have one issue that you want to get amended in a tax treaty, inevitably your treaty partner will want to talk about other issues, and this all takes time. Here what we had was a standardized approach. This also, I think, helped a lot of developing countries get these measures into place because this was now an international standard. So they didn't, even if they were trying to get this change with a large country, now that it's an international standard, it's hard for that country to say no. And the standard language was there. So I think this was a major achievement. As you could see, the current group of jurisdictions that have signed up mean that this would cover 14,000 of their bilateral tax treaties, 80% of the bilateral tax treaties in force. So that's pretty good. The ratification number, not so good, 11. But ratification takes time. And ratification processes in different countries can be quite complex. And this is a complex instrument to explain to parliamentarians. So in some ways, that is not surprising. We do have a number of ratifications in the pipeline, so you should be seeing that number grow in the very near future. Then separate and apart from that is the Action 6 peer review report. Originally, that was supposed to come out a bit earlier, but we recognized that until the MLI had been signed, it didn't really make sense to do a review of this, since that was going to be the main vehicle by which countries implemented Action 6. So that report now is well underway and should come out in early 2019. Then we have Action 13, maybe one of the most unpopular BEPS measures among the private sector, because this implied a lot of work for multinationals to gather this information. It also implied a lot of work for countries because they had to enact legislation to require this type of reporting. And so that, again, has been a very, very big, heavy lift for countries as well as for multinationals. But we've already made good progress on that. We have 57 jurisdictions that have now put in place the legislation to require this. The first exchanges took place in June, and we have 60 jurisdictions that have in place all of the legislation. This is covering 1,400 exchange relationships. Now you may say, well, 57 out of 119, that's not that great. But the 57 comprise some of the largest countries, which tend to have the largest multinationals. So I think we are capturing within this group already the main companies that were intended to be covered by this. We don't have all of the 119, partly because some have just joined, some have not yet signed agreements to enable this type of exchange. They haven't been able to enact the legislation to do this. So that number will continue to grow, and in particular in the area of developing countries, because they stand the most to gain from this, because they probably don't have companies within their own multinational groups that meet the threshold, so they will be net beneficiaries, recipients of information, if they put these laws in place. So quite important for them, and I suspect they will get the legislation and the other things needed to be able to carry this out in place as soon as they can. Now, Action 14, not a measure against base erosion and profit shifting, but rather a measure designed to help ensure that while we are tackling double non-taxation, we are not increasing the prospects of increased double or multiple taxation. And so that is why we included this action on dispute resolution, and we established a peer review. Now, every treaty has an article on mutual agreement procedure, but what we had heard repeatedly, not only from taxpayers but from countries, is that this process of resolving disputes was not terribly effective. And so we included Action 14 to try to make it more effective, but also to have the peer review so that we could hold countries accountable to what they had agreed to. And I think that is having impact. I think it was just yesterday that we published the latest MAP statistics showing how well countries are doing and what the caseloads look like. And I think there's a quite interesting story here because part of the Action 14 measure called for having a resolution of cases within 24 months. And that is a pressure that is put on competent authorities to close these cases. We also included, and it's not part of the minimum standard, mandatory binding arbitration, which was also designed really to act as a way to get competent authorities to agree. And so here what you see are some of the results of what's been happening so far on a practical level. You have 80% of the MAP cases concluded in 2017 having resolved the issue for transfer pricing cases, and 75% of the other cases, non-transfer pricing, being resolved, which is good. Approximately 65% of the transfer pricing MAP cases were closed with agreement, fully eliminating double taxation, with almost 15% of them also being granted unilateral relief. So again, another good result. Yes, the caseload is rising. That is something you will see, but in a sense, is that surprising with all this added focus on not only BEPS, but also improvement in the MAP procedure? One of the things that we tried to do through the Action 14 was to create greater awareness and understanding of the MAP procedure, increase the availability and access to MAP by taxpayers. And so in some sense, that should not surprise you that the caseloads are increasing. Now, if we look at the other non-minimum standards, we have not been systematically looking at take-up of those measures yet. Why? Because our hands are really full with the minimum standards and making sure that countries get the support they need to implement those minimum standards, which were really of the highest priority in this project. Nevertheless, there is quite a lot of take-up of these other standards, and one sort of streamlined way that this is happening is through the EU directives known as ATAD 1 and ATAD 2. These are the anti-tax avoidance directives, which then require the 28 members of the EU to implement those directives. So we've seen that with respect to the hybrid mismatch arrangements. The US tax reform has included Action 2. Australia and New Zealand have legislative proposals, and other countries as well. And hopefully we will soon be able to report this in a more systematic manner. But I believe that all of the accounting firms are keeping very close track of who has implemented what. Same is true for Action 3 on CFC legislation. We've seen take up, notably in Japan, strengthening of the rules in the US, and again within the EU, ATAD 1 requiring CFC legislation. Then Action 4, limitation of interest deductions. We have over 10 of our inclusive framework members that have already adopted this. The US again included this in its tax reform. I just received a call the other day from Peru. They have put forward their legislation on this, and they were seeking our support to make sure they can get it through. So this is a very popular one because I think this is the use of interest deductions as a way to shift profits is probably one of the easiest ways to shift profits, as many of you know. And so this is one of the tools that tax policymakers want to have to try and control base erosion, but it's also a competitiveness issue among countries, because if your neighboring country doesn't limit interest deductions and you do, then companies might go there rather than stay at home. And so having established an international standard in this area, even if it's not a minimum standard of the BEPS project, does help countries get this sort of thing implemented. And again, this is part of the EU ATAD 1. Now, what are the next steps and challenges in this area? Certainly, our work is not done, and some would say we're at the end of the beginning rather than at the end of the end. There's still an awful lot of work done simply on continuing the implementation process, ensuring that all of these 119 countries and jurisdictions are able to implement, first and foremost, the minimum standards, but also the other elements of the BEPS package that they are interested in implementing. And here what we've done is we have established, working with other international and regional organizations, a very strong capacity building program to help countries. We've also established a twinning program which pairs an OECD or a G20 country with a developing country to help them navigate this whole process, navigate the whole architecture of the inclusive framework, which is kind of complex because it's not just one body, but what we did was we opened up our Committee on Fiscal Affairs and all of its technical working groups, of which there are many, to all of these countries. And so, especially for very small countries, it's hard to manage all of this, and this twinning program is designed to help with that. We also have TIWB, which stands for Tax Inspectors Without Borders. This is a program that we are doing jointly with the UN, where we take experienced tax inspectors from one country and deploy them to another country to help those countries carry out better audits or do better risk assessment or whatever, all in the tax avoidance space. And this has been quite successful. Basically, we have concluded that for every dollar that is spent on the Tax and Inspectors Without Borders program, $100 is returned in terms of additional adjustments being made in the particular country where the program has been implemented. So very successful. Again, I think just this week or last week we published the report, the annual report on the results of Tax Inspectors Without Borders, and I think that has proven to be very helpful to countries. And I think it's also helped to ensure greater consistency in the application of the international rules, because in the countries where this program is being deployed, there is much more focused, individualized attention in terms of explaining how the rules are intended to be applied. Now, in terms of unfinished business, I already mentioned the whole issue of the digitalized economy, not the digital economy, and that we still have work to do there. And as I said, we'll have a whole panel on that tomorrow. Big challenges ahead, no single solution yet, but I think we've made a lot of progress, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. Then we have, as part of the BEPS package that was published in 2015, we have a number of items that we were supposed to come back to, and one was country-by-country reporting. We had agreement at the time that we published Action 13, but some countries expressed frustration that the threshold was too high or that the elements that were being reported were too limited. And so we had agreed that by 2020, we would revisit all of this. Now, of course, this is at very early stages because the first CBC reports were only just filed in June, and so until countries can analyze the information they already have, it's hard for them to say whether that is adequate. But that is work that we need to continue. The same with Action 4, the interest deductions. We had agreed to go back and look at that. This was really a major innovation in terms of the kinds of issues that the OECD addresses, and so we said we would go back, see how implementation has occurred, see whether some of the the limitations that had been put in there are adequate or whether there should be changes. Now, I've put separate because this was not technically part of the BEPS package, although we see it as an integral part of work in this area, is the whole issue of tax certainty. We have published with the IMF an initial report on tax certainty, I think 2 years ago. Last year we published another one, and we now within the Committee on Fiscal Affairs have asked each of our working parties to see how they can take forward this agenda of trying to improve tax certainty at the policy level, but also at the administration level. So that is ongoing work where I hope you will see improvements. And so with that, I will conclude and look forward to the discussion with the distinguished panel we have here on BEPS at 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. That was very helpful for us to analyze the progress made during these 5 years. Congratulations to you and your colleagues at the OECD for all of that you have achieved. It's also heartening to know that you are crossing several hurdles, and I guess it's a difficult time in the world to sort of navigate a multilateral solution. I think finally also it's important to sort of analyze as to whether the integrity of our international tax system is actually being preserved. My sort of first question really here would be that in parallel to what has happened the last 12 months with the OECD BEPS project, the US tax reforms have come in, and they brought a number of new themes to our world. We've got the BEAT, we've got the GILTI, and a number of other unilateral measures on base erosion as they have sort of dealt with it. How do you see the action by the US tax reforms on base erosion? Do you see this as complementing the work that the BEPS OECD project has done? And of course, the US is certainly a member of the OECD on these projects, and also the G20. So how would you sort of reconcile with this two patterns driving?
Well, I guess I would say that you need to look at the U.S. tax reform in its entirety. If you think about it, they started with the highest corporate tax rate in the whole of the OECD and reduced it to 21%. In order to be able to do that, they needed to ensure that they reduced the risk of tax avoidance and tax evasion as much as possible. And so on the one hand, I think, as I have already indicated to some extent in my presentation, they have taken a lot of steps to implement BEPS measures. And you saw that with strengthening their CFC legislation, interest limitation, hybrid mismatches, country-by-country reporting. I think that is huge. A lot of people thought, oh, the U.S. will never implement country-by-country reporting because the largest multinationals are in the U.S., and why would they expose their multinationals in that way? But to their credit, they did it, and they are exchanging this information with their treaty partners, and I think that's quite important. They also put in these other measures as backstops to their tax system, to protect the tax system. They certainly cannot afford to lose more revenue as a result of the changes that they made by reducing the tax rate. So I would see them as complementary. I know that some have said that, well, these, the BEAT and the GILTI show a lack of confidence in the transfer pricing rules, and that may be true, but in the end, I think these rules, just like the DPT in Australia and in the UK, these were measures that were put in as backstops to the other measures in countries where they felt there still wasn't enough. I mean, if you look around the world, what is the other big thing that is happening? The introduction of GARs. More and more countries are introducing GARs. Why? Because countries feel like no matter what they do in terms of trying to close loopholes, there will always be a clever tax practitioner or company that will try to get around it. And so they are looking for these backstops to protect their base.
Thanks, Grace. Rohan, for the longest time, you've been looking at both transfer pricing, advising clients, and of course BEPS, which is there. Grace brought in the point that yes, the US tax reform and some of the measures there could be held as complementary to base erosion, but sort of could undermine transfer pricing rules and the ALP principles. Is that how you also see it?
Yeah, I think, see, every country has a right to bring in incentives and reduce tax rates to the extent possible, which they feel appropriate. But if you really look at US and the US tax reform and more on the transfer pricing, they already have their 482 regs, which is basically looking at the arm's length principle. They also, so now what we're talking about is that BEPS in a way has not brought a change in the concept to arm's length. What it has said only that you have to look at substance and value creation. Now, probably US has gone ahead and said that while you have to go through the test of arm's length principle, go through the test of substance, if it crosses the related party payments or transactions cross a particular level, we will, tax you. So I think to a certain extent, I would feel it's a bit of a contrary stand to say that, okay, you prove that the related party transactions are at arm's length, you prove that there is substance, and then beyond that there is a kind of a disallowance to that extent.
Mr. Bansal, when we actually had the BEPS project beginning in 2013 and we sort of rolled back the environment here in India and India's position globally, and then you look at these 5 years, from a perspective of an emerging economy, a source-based economy, and we wanted to preserve our source-based taxation regulations and base erosion, how do you see these 5 years and the challenges that have been addressed?
First of all, I'll say that these 5 years have been the most tumultuous years or the most vibrant years in the international tax. And what we have seen in last 5 years was probably not even a fraction of it happened before this. So yes, overall there are positives and there are things which could have been done but have not been done. But ultimately we have to understand that for a cross-border issue or something on which we want to take an action which does not harm the taxpayer ultimately in terms of double taxation, then a consensus needs to be reached. So, to bring so many countries to a common table to agree to a set of rules itself was a challenge, and that happened through the G20 BEPS project, in which more than 40 countries participated and could reach consensus on a variety of issues. And then these rules were embraced by more countries, now 119 in the inclusive framework, which were not part of this decision making, but they still were convinced to adopt them and now adopting them. Now, second achievement was the MLI. Even the MLI is basically a tool to implement the BEPS minimum standards and some other treaty-related changes. And all the countries were not a part of the BEPS project, but many of them were part of the ad hoc group which drafted the MLI. So, including those countries at that stage itself was a big achievement. So I'll say that that also was a big achievement. And maybe for developing countries or emerging economies, the issue is of allocation of taxing rights, which was not an objective of the BEPS project per se. But still, a lot has been achieved in terms of adoption of anti-abuse rules or in terms of other base erosion preventing measures and exchange in terms of transparency, that CBCR is a major milestone or a big achievement. So a lot has happened in these 5 years. So we should look at the positives rather than looking at things that could have happened and have not happened. And ultimately, it's not the end of the road, because still we are discussing, we are coming up with new, all the countries are on the table, they are ready to discuss with an open mind. And of course, since the issues affect them individually, one cannot expect easy consensus. So it will go on, but ultimately, I think we should be very satisfied and happy with the way it has gone about and the way it is going on.
I think, sir, you made a very important point in there when you said that the BEPS project was about base erosion, and it was not about how the allocation rights need to move between source countries and residency. And that was not the subject matter of really the BEPS project. I think it will be interesting at this stage to sort of open up the floor for a question to the audience. We've had the talk from Grace. We've had some comments from the panel. Really the question is, do you think the BEPS project has created a more sustainable global tax system at the end of these 5 years? So 1, yes, 2, no. Happy to have the response from the audience. So a 2/3 vote in favor, or a little more than 2/3 vote of favor, yes, it has created a more sustainable. Well, there we have got 2 people to congratulate. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Grace, for this. I think coming to a part which we are seeing happening, and maybe that's sort of jarring to people who are taxpayers. Is this, we talked about the US tax reform, that's just one. You refer to the diverted profit tax that the UK has brought in. We are seeing a lot of countries bringing in unilateral action on base erosion simultaneous to what the work that you have been doing. So when you look at the implementation of BEPS project country by country, and also you see the unilateral actions being taken by countries, so how do you sort of look at this challenge that is emerging in a rather simultaneous manner? Is there a way you're trying to harmonize that in your mind to try and make sure that the vision of the OECD for the 21st century tax regime is actually going to get achieved? So, or are these unilateral actions not significant enough in your mind, Grace, to divert ourselves from the overall objective that OECD is delivering through the BEPS project?
Well, I would say that there actually haven't been that many unilateral measures apart from in the area of the digital economy or the digitalized economy. And that was, in some sense, fully foreseen in the Action 1 report, because, as I said earlier, we were not able to reach consensus at that time. And so we did identify different avenues that countries could take to deal with the issue. And India, I think, was one of the big advocates of taking action quickly, and did, in fact, take action quickly. And that is not inconsistent with what we were doing, because we said, okay, countries can go ahead because we haven't reached consensus. They just need to make sure that they stay within their international obligations. So I would say that in that area, you've had a lot of unilateral actions, but apart from that, I think overall, you've had the DPT, which, I would say was kind of unfortunate that came out in the midst of the BEPS project, but from what we have seen, or at least what we have heard from the UK, that it hasn't actually been applied. It's much more of an information gathering tool, and has resulted in taxpayers being more forthcoming. So in that sense, it's had a positive impact. And, you know, each country at the end of the day has the sovereign right to establish whatever tax laws it sees fit. But I do want to emphasize that what we continually hear in the global, in the inclusive framework, is that countries do want a global consensus. And so even when we were doing the Action 1 in 2015, India was saying, yes, we may go ahead, but we are still very interested in a global solution.
Sam, it's important to bring you in, and Sam wears many hats, and we've all known him over the years. But here he is representing TIE at this forum, and you got your members, and you got a lot of global multinationals who sort of sit within your forum. So Sam, when you look at the rollout of the BEPS project and you see the unilateral action by some of the countries, how are you as a representative of TIE responding to this?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So TEI stands for Tax Executive Institute. We are a Washington-based institute with more than 7,000 all in-house tax practitioners. So just to set the context. So in that regard, I think what I can say is that the concern from the tax community, the taxpayers community, is that I think we want to pay tax. You might be sort of surprised that I say that, but we only want to pay it once. See, so the concern here is that I think the world of double non-taxation and things like that, I think we have left that behind. I think that is, everyone is cognizant of it, including the very sort of the various measures against that. Really, the BEPS project, I think, has several effects. I think one is really proliferation, right? Not of weapons of mass destruction, but really proliferations of knowledge in terms of BEPS measures, anti-avoidance measures, right? And number two is the transparency. Certainly, the exchange of information has been sort of discussed. And these, on the taxpayer side, pose a number of challenges. Number one, obviously, is compliance burden, right? These days, you see in-house tax teams developing a new role called operational tax directors. So literally positions at a high level and with teams under them just to deal with the operational compliance and things like that. So you see the landscape evolving as well in terms of the in-house side, automation and things like that. In line with the point about paying tax once and only once, I think the concern we have, and this is something which we look to certainly the OECD and inclusive framework to engender, is really the integrity of the tax system. Because we find that at the edges, the unilateral measures are leading to certain inconsistent practices. For instance, certain countries declaring that their measures are not income tax and hence do not fall within the treaty network. Others, for instance, asserting that a VAT registration is a PE, amounts to a PE. So you find that these are sort of the old sort of clear distinctions between the various sort of areas of taxes may be sort of merging and getting a bit less well defined.
Thank you, Sam. I think one of the other aspects is that a large amount of the treaties which would get impacted by the MLI, some of them are based on the UN model and or a hybrid between the UN and the OECD. And the UN has also been talking about certain measures for changes in the UN Model Convention. So my question really to Rohan and then Mr. Bansal, if you could also articulate as to, do you see that the measures that are being talked about by the UN as a part of the Model Convention aligned to what the BEPS-based erosion projects are, or do you see any disharmony there?
No, I think at a principal level, I would believe that there is a common point of interest, which is in terms of the fact that whether it's a UN country or an OECD country, the objective is, or at least it would look like that they would want to have the tax pie enlarged. So there is a certain common point of interest, but to that extent, I would say that it's a case where if the taxpayer has $100 of profit, it is going to be reallocated. So to that extent, if it's earlier was a 60-40 kind of a split between UN countries and OECD countries, if it becomes 45-55, that's going to be reallocation. So to that extent, there is a bit of a conflict of interest as well, because one is looking at the same amount of profit, unless the the profit, 100 profit becomes 120, which is where the taxpayer comes into play. So to that extent, I would say that that's not the best kind of a scenario where the profit itself enlarges, where the taxpayer then, and as Sam said, multinationals want to pay tax, but want to pay tax only once and want to pay tax on the right base. I think on transfer pricing, there could be some differences in the approaches. I feel that, for example, on comparability, when you look at, and the way UN wants to really look at it is on a transaction by transaction basis, whereas OECD normally would prefer bucketing the transactions, and only where the data is available on a transaction by transaction basis, that's when that would come into play. Again, the other part is that if you really look at the P clause in the MLI, and that's where the UN countries had proposed one of the clauses to be mutually agreed was on the permanent establishment, which is where the OECD countries have not gone by it. So to that extent, the objective is similar, the intention is good, but there are going to be there are some differences on the ground.
Actually, the difference between UN model and OECD model in approaches is about the allocation of taxing rights. And as I just said in my previously, that the BEPS project did not per se address the issue of allocation of taxing rights. Now, the 2017 model of UN model revision, if you see, is it has adopted all the changes of MLI, probably except the anti-splitting of contracts, that is Article 14. Other than that, everything that the MLI has is trying countries to adopt is incorporated in the UN model. So to that extent, I find that as far as BEPS minimum standards and the other optional provisions which are being tried to be achieved through the MLI are already included in the model UN Convention of updation in 2017. So probably there is no conflict or no difference of view. And now see, at this stage probably we should have had more minimum standards in the BEPS project than just these many, because ultimately what we are seeing is that few countries are adopting the provisions even in MLI. MLI signatories may be 80 plus, but if you look at how many provisions they have adopted, then it is less than 50% except for Action 6 related minimum standards or Action 14 related minimum standards. So, I mean, as far as the coherence between the UN approach and OECD approach is concerned, in relation to BEPS outcomes, so far there is no divergence. Whatever recommendations of BEPS project are not yet either adopted through MLI, or they are of course to be seen by UN body as well, and the countries are seeing them on their own, whether they will incorporate them through their bilateral treaties or wherever some domestic law provision change is required, whether they would want to do it. So no major divergence I see.
Thank you, sir. I think as we will open up for a second poll question, I sometimes wonder that if we didn't go through the BEPS project and the MLI, was there any other option that lay before us as a global community to deal with the integrity of our tax system? Maybe it would be too early for us to go through the formulary approach here, specifically in relation to the digital economy. So while we have responses from the panel, maybe the audience can also start thinking of the response to the question that's being polled. And that question is really, do you think the countries that are undertaking the unilateral changes, are these significant enough? Or you believe they are not significant enough from the perspective of the first question, which is that are we walking towards a globally robust international tax regime? So while you get your poll questions in, I'll, in the interest of time, ask the panel to comment on whether is there really an answer, a solution different than what the BEPS MLI outcome is?
Maybe I'll start. If you're asking whether we should have gone to formulary as opposed to the BEPS project and the MLI, I would say no, in the sense that I haven't heard a single country in the inclusive framework say, let's just, put all this aside and let's do formulary. I think countries, apart from the practical complexities, I think they also see there's some risk there in going to a full-blown formulary approach. Having said that, we are seeing formulary approaches come into our transfer pricing rules. So I would say there's some gradual movement in that area, but I think the good thing about the BEPS project was that it tackled a number of very specific issues and ways by which base erosion and profit shifting was being achieved beyond the transfer pricing area.
Any comments from your side on whether we could have adopted anything else but the BEPS OECD approach with the MLI?
See, I think the earlier question you mentioned about the global formulary approach, I think very clearly OECD, if you look at the history, they themselves had not accepted and rejected that method, because that would not conform to an arm's length principle to that extent. Again, getting into this, I think I don't think the BEPS objective was to really determine how to really segregate and appropriate the profits to that extent. So I would say that if it's going to be a case where countries come on the table and agree on something, it's something different. But as a standard kind of a guidance, a global formulary approach or a similar method may not be the right way.
That brings me back to Sam. Sam, for the longest time, we have seen tax planning in a particular form and shape, which involves use of tax treaties, which we are accustomed to, setting up holding companies or intermediate companies, building some substance around there, and of course, getting to a situation where we sort of segregate functions and place them where best suited. So really, when we look at the entire advent of the BEPS project and the efforts on preventing base erosion, what do you think is going to be the response for multinational enterprises towards the tax planning? Is tax planning dead or is it alive?
Well, that's a great question, and there can only be one answer for me. The tax planning is alive because I'm conflicted. But I think, jokes aside, I think tax planning will, to my mind, continue, but perhaps in a different shape or form. Right? Certainly, there are many quarters in the tax community who are much used to the certainties, perhaps, of the old, and they take a much more sort of legalistic interpretation of the rules. Even with the evolution of the new sort of landscape, let's just take, for instance, the patent boxes, right? Really, you actually see post-BEPS a proliferation of even more patent boxes than before. And each of them have their own sort of intricacies in terms of drawing the lines as to what is incentivizable, what is not incentivizable income, all sort of a passing muster, no doubt, with the nexus, modified nexus approach. So if anything, the complications have not reduced. Same thing for US tax reform. I mean, there were some quarters that were looking for simplification, but some of the US tax reform actually brought back some of the old sort of calculations in terms of bucketing and things like that, those of you who have been through it. So the complications have not reduced, and hence I think the role of tax planning will continue to be there. It will change and evolve because of those two things which I mentioned, right? The proliferation of knowledge of anti-avoidance measures, the transparency. I will end by saying that sort of from taxpayers' perspective, sometimes we are schizophrenic, right? At least as far as large taxpayers are concerned. On the one hand, all these have brought a lot of pain, a lot of compliance. I mean, that is without doubt burden and things like that. On the other hand, if you are a large taxpayer and you are a big multinational, your policies have already stood the scrutiny of some of the toughest countries in the world, including, for instance, the likes of Germany and things like that. So sometimes you wonder, you would prefer that the rest of the world at least challenge on a principled basis, right? Instead of issuing sort of audits with revenue targets and all kinds of arguments which are in the parlance would be unprincipled challenges comes true. That's much more difficult.
So Sam, if I was to replay what you said, is tax planning is a lie, but old habits die hard. Grace.
Yes, I just want to say that I think as long as we have tax laws, there will be tax planning. The question is whether the BEPS project has helped to rein in some of the more aggressive tax planning so that we have tax planning that comports with both the letter and the spirit of the law.
And how will we deal with the heightened tax scrutiny now? And firstly, is there a heightened tax scrutiny post-BEPS? So, Sam, you cover a lot of territory and a lot of jurisdictions. So, when you go around your vast territories, what does it show you? Is there sort of jurisdictions on fire and flames with tax audits sprouting all over?
Short answer is yes. Certainly yes. Led to increased scrutiny, right? For instance, I cover Africa, and Africa is lighting up like a sort of light bulbs on a big screen. And very often you find that these are also the result of the diffusion of knowledge, as I mentioned, right? But I would like to just conscious of time, but I'd like to mention that I think one big sort of black hole and sort of area where you hardly hear of is East Asia. Right? Whether digital, you find that the most digital savvy countries are Korea, China, Japan, but you don't seem to hear of their views and their practices in the international debate. I think that is something which I find fascinating because I cover Asia as well.
So Grace, I know we are short on time, but is there anything in the BEPS project that helps deal with the situation that heightened scrutinies will happen and potentially disputes will be far increased at times? So where in the BEPS project do we find the ability to deal with the heightened risk or scrutinies? And is there also something that the peer review deals with which enables the scrutinies to be far more principled?
Well, the heightened scrutiny should not be a surprise to anyone. I mean, if you have world leaders like the G20 leaders focusing on this issue and saying something has to be done, they don't mean the OECD has to write a bunch of nice reports. They want to see action on the ground and implementation. So it should not surprise anyone that there is heightened scrutiny, more audits of BEPS-type issues. Now, the question is, as Sam has said and you have suggested, whether that scrutiny will be in accordance with the BEPS action measures, with the transfer pricing guidelines, all of the international standards. In other words, principled scrutiny as opposed to a money grab. And that is something that is challenging to address, but one of the ways that we are trying to address this is through increased capacity building, as I mentioned before, so training of people, working with them through Tax Inspectors Without Borders, but also that was precisely the reason that we made Action 14 a minimum standard, to try to ensure that we don't end up with double or multiple taxation as a result. In addition, beyond the BEPS project, we have our Forum on Tax Administration, which is focusing very much on this issue and doing a global awareness training of what these standards are and how they should be applied. So work is underway. Is there peer review right now of specific cases? No, in part because there is taxpayer confidentiality to think about.
Gokul, if I may just add, to give a taxpayer's perspective on the heightened audits, yes, there is a concern and there is a worry that the audits will be more detailed. But given the current scenario, I think that's something that they have to live with. What I think Deloitte, since BEPS has been introduced, carry out the survey each year. And one of the feedbacks or the important aspects was that 80% of the taxpayers respondents who responded actually said that more than the heightened audits, what they are worried about is the interpretations that local authorities would take on certain aspects. And so, for example, value creation, it's very subjective and not very clearly defined. So to that extent, that could be an issue which would lead to double taxation. The other important aspect that came about is that while BEPS is there, it's fine. The aspect about, since BEPS has come in, a lot of media, political parties and activists have come into play, and to that extent there's a reputational risk involved. So there is a slightly different take from a taxpayer's perspective on the entire approach.
Thank you, Rohan. In the interest of time, and we are out of time, firstly, the poll results of the last question I didn't highlight. 2/3 of the audience did believe that unilateral action by different countries are impacting. There is a third question, a final question, which is around the topic which we just discussed, which is whether tax structures which you are implementing as taxpayers today, are these under greater scrutiny by tax administrators than they would have been a year ago or 5 years ago before BEPS started? The question is yes and no. While you sort of punch on to that, I think I will lead on to Mr. Bansal to talk about our final question for the afternoon, which is, do you see India, through its domestic law, having really walked down the path of most of the BEPS recommendations? And B, India is, of course, a signatory onto the MLI. When do we see the ratification by India? And also connected to that, could you elaborate a little bit about the process leading to the ratification and its impact?
Now, as you said, most of the provisions which were to be affected through the domestic, quite a few of the provisions which were to be affected through the domestic law have been already taken care of in India, or rather have been adopted by India. For instance, on interest deduction, we have introduced the required change. In relation to exchange of CBCRs, whatever was to be done in the Indian legislation has been done. So now the TFDE, the Action 1 permitted a unilateral action by countries, even though it was not recommended. So one of the options India has adopted, that is equalization levy. And in MLI, we are perhaps one of the few countries which have opted for most of the provisions, and very few are like India, which have opted for as many. So we are on the track of adopting most of the BEPS project outcomes and rather making the best out of it. And regarding your second question on MLI ratification, till date, I think 11 have ratified, as Grace's presentation showed, and we are also working on it. And the process is that firstly, with the cabinet approval, we signed the MLI in May 2017, and now we are working on the ratification process. I cannot comment on the exact timeline, but yes, we are also we are very much conscious of doing it as early as possible. And why there is a delay, I'll just like to explain, because The MLI positions, once they are submitted at the time of ratification, are the final positions in respect of the articles as well as in terms of your reservations, your notifications. You can relax a reservation later, but you cannot make it more strict. So, and mismatches with other countries is something which needs to be taken care of, otherwise it will lead to implementation problems. So, we are taking up bilaterally and through OECD Secretariat wherever there is a mismatch and trying to resolve it and be very sure as we can be, because nobody can be 100% sure, that when we submit our final position, it is to our satisfaction, and then we should also be able to join the 11 countries or some more which precede us in ratifying the MLI.
Rohan?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Mr. Bansal talked about since the introduction of the action plans, but I must admit and accept the fact that a lot of stance that you see in the action plans were first taken by the Indian tax authorities. I remember a decade back, the Indian authorities talking about, risks are important, but functions are equally important. And that's what actually is getting captured in the BEPS action plan. Well, as also, if you see Circular 6, which was introduced by India way back in June 13, which talked about looking at the conduct of the parties and rather than on contractual obligations, is again something that we find in the BEPS action plan. So I think the stance taken by the authorities, although we at that point of time thought that the Indian authorities are being far too aggressive, it finds a place in the action plan. So.
And so, same thing one can say for the unilateral actions in respect of digital economy. I mean, perhaps we were the first ones to do it, but afterwards one can see that number of other countries, for instance, Israel or France, or you can count a whole lot of countries, and in fact, EU is very much sensitized to do something about it. So perhaps we were not so wrong. And we did take an action for which was in line with the Action 1 mandate, and on which, as Grace said, that no consensus could be reached. So one can say that this will take a long time, but in the long run, we might all be dead. So at some point of time, one may have to take some call and take some action.
Well, they also say, sir, there are only two certainties, death and taxes, and that doesn't get worse every year. Thank you, everyone, for being a wonderful audience and for responding to all the questions. The last question, in case you didn't see the result, 90% of the people say they experience heightened risk of tax scrutiny post-BEPS. But hopefully, we take confidence, Grace, that the audits are going to be far more principled. And as Sam said, hopefully the transmission of knowledge is useful between the tax administrators so that at least we are fighting on principled grounds. Thank you, everyone, for being a wonderful panel. Thank you, Grace, for coming all the way to be with us. Mr. Bansal, you took our time. And more importantly, we are very confident that having renegotiated the controversial Mauritius Treaty and then the Singapore Treaty, you will navigate us through the MLI too. Sam, thank you for being here and sharing your experiences. And finally to Rohan. Thank you, everyone. And I think it's now time for coffee.